plants evolved from single-celled organisms. And so they're very closely related to a single-cell organism still alive today called algae. That's that green scum that you see on top of the like ponds and lakes and things. But even in the saltwater, in the oceans, there's different types of single-celled organisms. And what's important is that those single-celled organisms, and it was back about this time of the Silurian, they started to produce these pigments. These are proteins inside of the cells. And these are the pigments, chlorophyll A and B, some carotenoids. These are pigments then that can absorb the certain wavelengths of radiation from the sun, and that's how they're photosynthesizing. Okay, before that, cells didn't have the ability to access the sunlight like that. So it actually really started with the bacteria. And so this was a way then to make more energy, or to harness the energy to make food. And they made food in the form of carbohydrates, and plants then store it as starch. And so do these algal ancestors. They would store the carbohydrates they made, the sugars, into a form called starch. So again, in a single cell, you would just store a little bit within the cell. But now when we go through and we see how complex plants can get, they store starch in their tissues, mainly in their roots. And you eat it. You eat carrots, right? You eat potatoes and all that kind of stuff. That's the starch that they're storing. That's the energy, the food they made, and we're going to eat it. Okay. The other thing they do is they began to have a material called cellulose in their cell wall, in the plasma membrane, which made the membrane a little more rigid, right? And gave some strength to it. That sets the stage then if you're going to be moving on the land, now you have to deal with gravity, right? And so if you have a cell wall that will allow you to overcome some gravity and have some strength to the cell, and then you add a cell on top of that and another one, you become multicellular, well, then you can start to grow upward toward the sunlight. So that's what this slide is kind of showing, the different types of algae that we have. This is what's called a phylogenetic tree. You'll just start looking at these now. Later in the semester is when you'll really start working with these phylogenetic trees. But this is a way that we can see relationships between organisms over time. So you can see at the very bottom, we had an ancestral eukaryote, right? And so again, that's a single-celled organism early in time that started all of this. And so from that ancestor, that single cell, they developed the structures inside of the cell that had those pigments in them. That structure is called a chloroplast. Okay, and that contains those chlorophyll A and B pigments and carotenoids, and there's others. But those are what are used then to absorb the sun's energy, right? And then, so everything above this mark of the evolution of the chloroplast, that means every organism above that also gained that chloroplast, probably from hereditary. It was hereditary, it was passed down over thousands and millions of years of generations. Okay, and then we'll see later, we're going to study red algae. You see a branch, that means this is a group of organisms that branched off and developed some unique traits. And in this case, it formed a group that we call red algae. Okay, and you can see then there was at one point of individuals that had the red pigment that the red algae retained, it was lost. And so now we have the pigment of the green algae, or the green pigment in there. So again, you're absorbing different wavelengths of the sun based on the color of the pigment. So we still have green algae today, but these are not plants yet. Okay, but there are ancestors because we share the traits. So anything now above here shares this trait with the green algae. Okay, and then we see evolution of multicellular sporophyte embryo with gametophyte tissues. We're going to talk about that with plants. that's then what distinguishes a land plant from algae, green algae. Okay, so they're all related in there. We also do know that plants live in water too. So if it's a organism in the water, it doesn't mean it's algae. It could be a plant in the water, but what we believe happened is that the plants evolved on land and then some of them returned to the water. Okay, because again, it's all about utilizing the environment the best that you can. And so if now all of a sudden they were so successful on land that it made sense that more food was actually available in the waters, some of the plants might return there. All righty, here we go. Come on. Okay, and so here's another phylogenetic tree where you can see the relationship between algae and then not just plants in general, but you're going to see the traits that develop over time that develop so that we diversified the types of plants that we have. We have 4 major groups of plants. And so the plants start here where it says bryophytes and mosses. Bryophytes is another term for moss. Okay, and we're going to look at those, right? So they're more closely related to algae because their body structures are more similar to algae. They don't produce seeds just like algae, and they don't have the tissues that to help them really grow tall on land. But then that started to develop. That's the early vascular plants. The vascularization, this is the tissue in the plant that allows them to draw water from the soil and bring it up to the rest of the plant. So they can grow quite tall. Okay, and again, I'll explain more of that in a minute. They still don't produce seeds though, that's our ferns. But then plants started to be able to use drier land. And one of the reasons they were able to do that is because they now produce seeds. Seeds have a coating on it to prevent water loss. So a seed has a little embryo on the inside that's developing into a new plant. You've got to have water to do that. Okay, and if you just spit a seed out into the environment, it could dry up. So the actual seed coating evolved to help prevent that from happening. So our seed plants, we've got 2 types, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms contain their seeds within a cone. They use a cone to disperse them, whereas angiosperms use flowers to develop the seed, and then that flower becomes a fruit and it protects the seed. So again, this is just kind of another phylogenetic tree. It just shows you, also they put the timeline on it so you can kind of see when these different things evolved over time. Okay, so again, you don't have to worry about knowing the details of a phylogenetic tree like this, because we're going to do taxonomy later in the semester. But I just want you to start to look at these things so they become familiar to you, and I'll show you how we read them. And for now, it's really showing the relationship between individuals and the succession of when different types of plants evolved over time, and then how they're related to one another. Alrighty. So again, this really just shows the evolution of plants and how they're related to algae and our ancestors of algae. We had a common ancestor with algae, and we know that because of these traits. We share these traits with them. Okay, but plants are a little different than algae because they do share a cell type, that's that eukaryotic cell. So that's just a more complex cell that has the organelles associated with them, a nucleus, the mitochondrion, the chloroplast, the Golgi apparatus, all of that stuff. But they're multicellular. Okay? So plants are always multicellular. There are no single-celled plants. Okay? They're autotrophic. So they share that with their ancestors. That, again, that means they can obtain energy from the sun. They also obtain the cell wall. They share that. And again, that's going to give some rigidity to their tissues so that they can grow up tall and kind of defy gravity a little bit. And then land plants live on land, but as I mentioned before, some of them were able to revert back and live in water. okay? But in order to adapt to land, right, now you're going from a moist, wet environment to a dry environment. So you have to deal with things like water loss and heat. How do you protect an embryo that's growing? Embryos also need a lot of water and stay moist in order to grow, right? So some of the adaptations we see for land plants that we don't see in the algae, so this is an adaptation to be on land, is to be able to get oxygen and CO2 from the atmosphere and release it. Okay, in the water, it just diffuses from the water across the cell membranes, and they diffuse in and out. In the air, you need to be able to obtain it from the air and bring it into your tissues. So one of the structures that does that is a little hole on the underside of leaves called stomata. And so the bottom two little pictures show you these stomata. These are cells that when they're kind of collapsed down, it closes a hole that's in between them. Okay, so now the plant is not able to get oxygen or CO2 exchange. But when they open up, and they do this, and we'll look at this a little later when we do plants, mainly the angiosperms, but they all have them. When they open up, then a little hole in the middle opens up called the stoma. Okay. And that's where gas exchange can occur. Alrighty, so this was a very major adaptation for these organisms now to be able to live on land. Okay, so the whole structure is called the stomata. The hole in the middle is called the stoma. Alrighty. There's a question. I still don't understand why plants don't take nitrogen from the atmosphere. It has to do with the molecule itself. So nitrogen is in a form, it's fixed. It's called N2. And it's just not a form that life can use. We just didn't evolve that way. We evolved so that we could use oxygen, O2. Plants evolved so that they can use CO2, but we don't have the mechanisms inside of our physiology to use N2, but bacteria do. So again, it's one of those mysteries of, it seemed to be, we have such a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, either within our bodies or in soil for plants, that that seemed to work just fine for us. Let the bacteria do the work at fixing nitrogen to put it in a form we can use. And it's, you know, life exploded from that. So we just don't have the mechanisms to do that, and we just didn't evolve that way. As we get into more talking about traits and how traits develop and how we adapt, you're gonna see that we have to have the genetic machinery in order to adapt to something. And for whatever reason, we didn't get that from our early ancestors. Okay, so the more the semester goes on, that might start to make more sense to you. Okay, the other thing, being on dry land, water can just evaporate out of your leaves, right? So one of the things they developed over the surface of leaves and stems and things is a waterproof cuticle. So these are specialized cells that can have like a waxy substance inside of it. And you can see in that upper picture of the water beating up, that makes it waterproof. So in this case, not too much water can be absorbed through the leaf, but that's okay because our roots underneath are absorbing water. But more importantly is that not too much water can evaporate from the surface of the leaf. Okay, because of this waxy cuticle. And I showed you earlier when we were looking at biomes in the chaparral biome, and you just walk outside yourself, if you have an oak tree, anything, you'll see the leaves are pretty waxy. They feel kind of thick. They have a waxy coating on them. And that again helps to prevent the water loss. So we have to do that. And then what about the embryo? The embryo have to develop and not dry out as well. So remember, life as we know it really depends on water. Everything has to keep moist, and otherwise things dry up and die out. And moisture helps to transport water or excuse me, oxygen and CO2 and nitrogenous things and all kinds of substances. We need water to transport that even within our bodies, and it's the same with cells or with plants. Cells then also transport things with the inside of their cells. It's all a watery medium. So that's how we know life as we know it. When we go to other planets and we want to find out if life is there, one of the first things we look for is water. Is there water? And then that might give us insight that there might be life on that planet. Okay, so embryos need that. And so they need to be protected by tissues in order to hold all that water in. And so we'll see that the embryos actually develop from a zygote. The term zygote is what we use once that egg and that sperm fertilize and they form a single-celled individual. That is called a zygote, that first cell. And then that cell divides and produces the multi-celled individual that you are. So an embryo starts as a zygote. The zygotes divide. As soon as it divides into two, it's not a zygote anymore. Now it's producing tissue. And that tissue is embryonic tissue. And then, so embryos are actually a collection of tissues that haven't formed organs yet. That's the next step, right? So it's the same as in animals like us, and the same with plants. Okay, and so because plants form embryos, sometimes they're called embryophytes. Embryophytes, that's the term we see there. And again, all of these plants, I put this back up here, these are the embryophytes. Everything that we know as a land plant, they're also known as embryophytes because they do produce an embryo in their tissues. So that's, we're going to look at that. We're going to see that, how they do that. Right? So you need organs to produce the cells to make the zygote, which will become an embryo. Right? So here's just some vocabulary you need to get used to. So the term gametangia means that's an organ that produces the egg and sperm in plants. Gametangia. So an egg and a sperm can be called, another term for that is gamete, right? The gamete is just a general term when we mean either an egg or a sperm. And that's the same in animals and us, okay? But a specific gamete, if we're talking about the egg, an egg is a gamete or a sperm is a gamete. So in algae and plants though, the organs that make the gametes are called gametangia. So that's the general term for it. Later in mosses, we're gonna look and we'll see that the organ that forms the sperm is called the antheridia. Okay, that's a type of gametangium. The IA at the end means it's plural. Okay, so many gametangia, but we can also look at like C is one gametangium. Okay, so in plants, the gametangia are multicellular, and only the very inner cells are able to divide and produce the either the egg or the sperm, depending on the plant, if it's a male or female. Okay, so they're able to, maybe remember, go from a diploid situation, having 2 copies of the chromosomes and dividing those into either egg or sperm and dividing their chromosomes in half. So each egg and each sperm only carries half the number of chromosomes. Because you have to do that. Because if the egg and sperm, they have to fuse together, then if each have half the chromosome, that means the offspring has the full number of chromosomes. If we just had our regular cells merging together, so like for humans, if we had a cell with 46 chromosomes merged with a cell with 46 chromosomes, you would have a 92 chromosome individual, right? That wouldn't be human anymore. Okay, so in the process of reproduction, we have to cut our chromosomes in half in order to produce offspring that have the correct number of chromosomes. That's what sexually reproducing organisms do. Okay, so this is just kind of a general look at gametangia. When we look at certain types of plants, again, we're going to look more specifically at what kind of gametangia they have. And then I put this table, it's from your book. So again, this is just plants to be able to move onto land, they have to overcome the challenges that the dry environment posed to them. And so again, a lot of it is about being dry. So a lot of what the adaptations of land plants is to avoid that. But then once animals started to also evolve onto land, and they were being eaten, you're going to also see adaptations for plants to avoid being eaten. So I'm not going to go through each one of these because as we study certain plants, these things are going to come out. So you can always come back and refer to this for the types of adaptations that we have. Alrighty. So one of the major hallmarks of algae and plants is this reproductive strategy called the alternation of generations. Alternation of generations. Basically, it means they're alternating their lives between a haploid stage and a diploid stage. Okay, so what do I mean by that? The haploid stage, again, is that most of the cells in their body is actually only has one copy of the genes. Okay, one copy of the chromosome. So the haploid, we distinguish that with a small letter N. Okay, we don't use a capital N because that meant population size, right? So we use a small letter N. So the plant, or even the algae, but we'll talk plants, the plant when it's in this stage is called a gametophyte. Gametophyte, because it's at this stage that they produce the egg and the sperm. So all they have to do is just divide their cell and put a full copy of their genes in there because their full copy is haploid. Okay, a little bit different than what I explained before with sexually reproducing species. This is why plants are a little bit different. Okay, so in the gametophyte stage, and this is a life cycle of their body. Their plant will actually, all of their cells will be haploid. Okay, and so we're kind of introducing this now. When we see specific plants, we're going to come back to this life cycle like this. Okay, so it's the gametophyte that can produce the egg and the sperm. Most gametophyte plants have a male and a female version. So it'll either be male or it'll be female. So of course, males produce sperm, females produce eggs. Okay, some plants can produce both the egg and the sperm. Okay, and we'll see those examples. Okay, so so during this stage, during the gametophyte stage, they're usually at this stage in a very stable environment, because think about that. You only have one copy of your genes when you're haploid. So if something happens to you and destroys a gene that's important, you won't be able to survive. So we see plants in the haploid stage when they're usually in a very stable environment. So we're going to see plants when the water environment is actually more stable than land because of the dryness, right? So we're going to see early plants evolve that are still very dependent on moisture. And their dominant stage is the haploid stage. And moisture is needed for sperm and egg to move around, or sperm at least to get to the egg. So we have to have a lot of moisture here. Okay, and so they do, they produce egg and sperm, they come together and they fuse, they form that zygote. So the process of coming together and fusing is fertilization, right? And then they form that zygote, and that becomes, we can call it the fertilized egg. It means their DNA are coming together and they're forming a diploid cell. The single cell is the zygote. That cell then divides by mitosis. Mitosis is the cell division, then to divide that cell into two, and those two into four, and so on and so forth. But you maintain the same number of genes. So each new cell still becomes diploid. Okay, because you got the diploid situation because an egg and a sperm fused with one another. Okay, now the body that is produced from the embryo as it grows, it becomes a sporophyte. Okay, a sporophyte. So we're going to see with early plants that these gametophyte and sporophytes are actually really different plants. Okay, they might be from the same individual, but they're very structurally different. As we get into to flowering plants and gymnosperms, the cone plants, you're going to see that one becomes more dependent on the other, that the gametophyte actually gets embedded in the tissues of the sporophyte. Okay. Then a sporophyte will go back into a gametophyte stage because they will produce cells. They'll divide those cells by meiosis. Meiosis is the process of dividing a cell and cutting the number of chromosomes in half. Right? So that brings us back into the haploid gametophyte generation. Those cells that are divided by half in this early type of plants are just called spores. Spores now can develop a new gametophyte, which can then develop sperm. Okay, that's what's called the alternation of generations, a really important aspect of plants. And so we're actually, when we look at plants, we're going to come back to this often. So if you're right now going, wait, I don't get it, wait until we apply it to plants themselves. Okay, alternation of generations. So getting into our plants, there's actually 4 types of plants, 4 main types. From there, we get a lot of different species, right? A lot of different groups. So the 4 main types of plants, the first ones we might just call bryophytes. And let me actually zoom in on this one. That's the upper picture there, a bryophyte. Those are like your mosses and things. These are plants that don't have vascular tissue, means they do not have the means within their body to conduct water from the soil to the tips of their plants. Okay, so that's non-vascular. They also don't produce seeds as well. Alrighty, so bryophytes, non-vascular and seedless. But then over time, we started to see plants then develop vascularization. These are cells that can produce tubes that run throughout the plant to conduct water. So now they have a means of pulling water out of the soil and moving it throughout their entire plant body, right? And the same with sugars. They can produce sugars. They can also distribute that throughout the entire plant body. So those are vascular plants. But we also see this group that's in the blue panel there. This group all still doesn't produce seeds. So these are things like ferns and stuff that we're going to look at those. And then the last 2 groups of plants, they're both vascular plants, but they produce seeds. But the method of producing seeds is 2 different ways. So I already kind of pointed this out to you. Those are your gymnosperms. These are plants that produce cones, and their seeds are just kind of right inside the cone. The cone can open up and they're exposed to the environment. So we call those naked seeds. Or we look at the group that produces flowers, and those are angiosperms. And the flower is where the egg and the sperm come together. And then that zygote gets, when it produces a seed, it gets protected inside of a fruit. So the flower actually becomes a fruit. So angiosperms are flowering plants, or you can call them fruit plants. All right, so that's those 4 types. Non-vascular, seedless, vascular, seedless, vascular with seeds, and the types of seeds are separated into 2 groups. Okay, so here's a little more detail, and this is an overview, and then we'll go deeper into moss for this one. So again, if you're a non-vascular plant, it means you don't really have true roots, stems, or leaves. Okay, and so here's a picture of moss. You've all seen moss probably. Go out at where usually there's kind of a moist area in your yard or something, maybe a leaky faucet. You might see it looks like this little small carpet of green stuff on it. That's moss. Okay, mosses, because they don't have roots and stems and leaves, they don't have the vascularization, they're not able to grow up tall. So they're very, very small plants, and they can only get water and then therefore oxygen and CO2 and everything through diffusion. It's just got to diffuse through their tissues. All righty. So we also refer to them as bryophytes. That's just a Greek word that means moss-like. So you might hear the term bryophyte. We're referring to mosses. So that's non-vascular. So remember, if it's non-vascular, it's going to be a very small plant, very, very short. And I'll show you some close-ups in a minute. Okay. Vascular seedless plants, these are your ferns and also club mosses. So I got some pictures there of a fern in the upper right, and then the other one, kind of the plants hanging down, that's called a club moss. So these have vascular tissue. Okay, so what do I mean when I'm referring to vascular tissue? So I put this one here for you. Vascular tissue are cells that produce a structure called a xylem. So xylem are cells that have a hole in the middle, and they produce a tube, and they stack on top of one another to produce a long tube. And then water can move through it, and whatever dissolved minerals that are in there, like the products of nitrogen fixation that comes out of the soil. So the plant can distribute that throughout its body. Okay, and then there is a different set of tubes called phloem, and this conducts the organic molecules that the plant makes, the food it makes, the sugars. So the leaves might make the sugars. It's going to transport those sugars down to the root where it gets stored as starch. So this is kind of homologous to our cardiovascular system, our arteries and veins, except we don't separate that into water conducting and nutrient conducting. Ours are really get separated based on if it's carrying oxygen or not. Okay, but it's the same. You can kind of think the same situation. And then I put on the side there lignin with an exclamation point. Lignin is a substance that can also provide structure to these cells so that they don't flop over. They're not limp. It makes them strong. So that's why vascular plants can grow tall. A redwood tree is a vascular plant. Okay, so it's kind of defying gravity. It can grow tall and not just fall over. The mosses don't have that, so they can never grow tall. Alrighty. The ferns, though, you're thinking, and club mosses, looking at them today, they're not very tall. Well, back in the Carboniferous age, they were as tall as our trees. So they just got out-competed by the gymnosperms and the angiosperms that evolved later. Okay. So, and when we get to those, we'll talk about why that is. So seedless, they also do not produce seeds. So just like we saw in that alternation of generations, they also do that as well, and they will produce a spore. So we'll have examples of that when we focus on ferns. Okay, and then your vascular plants, again, they're also vascular just like the ferns are. And so they have the xylem and phloem, very well organized. So when you cut through the trunk of a tree, you can see actually where the xylem and phloem, how it's arranged. We'll see that later when we focus on these plants. But what's new for these now is the seeds. So now they're protecting their embryo inside of a seed, and the embryo is dormant until it's ready to reproduce. Okay. Until the conditions are right, and that seed will open up, allowing the embryo to start to grow. Okay, and so again, we can separate our vascular seed plants into two groups. It's based on how they protect the seed. So our gymnosperms are over on the right there. That's like our pine trees. That's a spruce tree there. They produce cones. You can see the cone. And inside of the cone, that opens up and the seeds are just exposed to the environment. So sometimes they call those naked seeds. Whereas over to the bottom left is the flowering plants. So I put some sunflowers there. They produce seeds, all right? But their seeds get protected inside of a fruit, right? And so they can either be, and we'll get into this later, we can separate flowering plants into monocots or dicots. So that's just a teaser. That's to come. Okay, so 4 types of plants. What I want to do is get into the mosses though. So the first type of plant we'll look at are those mosses. Remember, they're also called bryophytes. Remember, they're non-vascular, so therefore they're typically small. And because of that, they require a moist environment. So you always see mosses in areas, usually on the edges of lakes and ponds. Even at home, they might develop where you have a leaky faucet, something like that. So it requires that moist environment because of growth, because they're non-vascular, right? And so they need to be able to get their nutrients and their oxygen and CO2, everything comes through diffusion. We'll see they have a structure that's similar to a root, but it's not a true root. And we'll see why. And then they also disperse their egg and sperm into the environment. So they need water to do that. So that's the reproduction part. Okay. So the types of bryophytes, sometimes overall we call them mosses, but there's actually a plant called mosses. There's also a classification called liverworts, and then there's also hornworts. So let's look quickly at their structure. So this picture here kind of shows a close-up of a moss-type plant, a bryophyte. So you can all see leaf-like structures, the green, stem-like structures, right? Toward the bottom, you see little fine filaments sticking out. Those are root-like structures, but they're not true stems, leaves, and roots, okay? So the things that look like roots are rhizoids. They're hair-like, they're somewhat absorptive. They can store some moisture, but they don't store organic materials that the plant makes, so it's not a true root. Its main job is to anchor the gametophyte stage of the plant. So what you're looking at there are gametophytes. The gametophyte stage is the dominant stage of mosses. So that's the plant that you're actually looking at. So all of the cells that create those tissues that makes it look like that plant are haploid. Okay, the dominant stage in mosses is gametophyte. And then the stem-like structure just kind of holds the plant upright, but again, there's no vascularization, so there's no lignin. It does have cellulose because it's a plant, but it's not very strong, so mosses don't get very high. And this is a really close-up view of one. And then the blades are similar to blades. It's just a single layer of cells that are undifferentiated. So it means they don't have a different job. So that's why it's not a true leaf. We'll see that a leaf and the other plants are an organ, that the cells are differentiated and they do different jobs within the leaf. Okay. All righty. So again, these aren't really the same as roots, stems, and leaves. So that's why we don't call them that. Okay. So that's the overall structure. So again, here's the alternation of generation. The gametophyte stage is the dominant stage, and the sporophyte stage is dependent on the gametophyte. That means that the sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte. And let me go. Here's a real close-up picture. So this is moss down here on the left, showing the gametophyte generation. That's long-lived. That's what most of the stage of a moss is gametophyte. Some of those plants that you see there are male and some are female. Okay, and then they disperse their egg and sperm, and when that occurs, this sporophyte will grow out of them. So this is the sporophyte stage, and you can see at the very base over on, so the sporophyte are on the right, at the very base, you can see the gametophytes. So these sporophytes are actually growing out of them. Okay, and it's very short-lived, only long enough to develop the spores. So this is the 2N diploid, only long enough to develop the spores and disperse the spores to make new gametophytes, right? And so that's what we see here, the alternation generation. So we split it between the sporophyte stage at the top and the gametophyte stage at the bottom. And it isn't an equal split in the circle because we're trying to show you here that the gametophyte stage is dominant. So how do you start with where should we start? We're going to start with the gametophyte number 1 at the bottom there. So that's a mature gametophyte plant. And it's got a little box at the top of each of those plants. Because what they're showing is that the very tip of the plant is where the organs are to produce the egg and the sperm, right? And so the name of the organ is escaping me all of a sudden. Bam. Whoops. Let me go back here for it. All of a sudden that's escaping me. Gametangia. Wow. Sorry, guys. Sometimes you just forget words. There we go. So let me go back here. So at the very tip from number 1, that's where the gametangia are. So again, gametangia were that was that general term for either the male or the female organs. So now we can name it, if it's a female organ, it's called archegonia. Okay, archegonia, you see that at number 2 at the top. Archegonia produce eggs. So there's many archegonia, or we can look at one archegonium, right? So archegonium is singular. If it's IA, that means it's plural, okay? The other plants are male, and they, at the tips of their plants is the male organs called antheridia. Okay, so you see several antheridia there. You can zoom in on one antheridium. They produce the sperm. So in order for the egg and the sperm to get together, there's usually like rain, some kind of moisture droplets that hit the top of those plants, and boom, the egg and the sperm, mainly the sperm, pop out. Okay, and the egg can pop out too, and then they come together and they fertilize, and that ends the haploid stage at that point, because fertilization means the 2 haploid cells are fusing together. And once they do, they form the zygote. So now you can see the zygote there, just in a protective layer of one cell layer thick. So not super protective. So this thing could dry out pretty easily. But that's why mosses then stick to the moist areas. You won't see moss in really dry area, okay? So number 3, that's the zygote. That's a single-celled diploid cell. Now it's gonna divide by mitosis. So now it can divide the cell into 2, 4, 6, 8, it keeps going, 2, 4, 8, 16. It keeps going. And it produces this, it copies the same amount of DNA, the 2 copies, the copy from the sperm and the copy from the egg. That gets maintained. And develops the embryo, and the embryo develops into the sporophyte. So now you can see the sporophyte, and it's growing out of the tip of the archegonium. Okay. And so that's why we said the sporophyte was dependent on the gametophyte, because it grows out of the tip of the archegonium, which is on the gametophyte plant. So the sporophyte is just that brown stalk coming up. At the top is a capsule. And inside of there now are cells dividing that are creating spores. Okay, it's that structure at the top underneath the cap is called a sporangium. So now cells are dividing by mitosis to produce spores. They're all cells are dividing by meiosis to develop spores, which are going to be haploid. Okay, haploid spores.
Is the gametophyte its own separate plant that, the sporophyte, is it its own separate plant that is just using the structure of the gametophyte, or are they still one plant technically?
Yeah, I guess you would say it's still one plant technically, because it still has the DNA, well, half the DNA of the one gametophyte. Your question is almost like, when a woman has a baby, is that baby still part of her, right? Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Right? So maybe that analogy is a good way to explain that. Our babies are dependent on our bodies for growth. And so in this stage, you're going to see that, yeah, the sporophyte stage is still dependent on the body. And you know, the baby portion would be the zygote and the embryo between 3 and 4. Right? The sporophyte, then as the embryo grows into the sporophyte, it's a separate structure, but it's still attached to the embryo. It's still attached to the gametophyte. Right? And this will make more sense as we get into the more complex plants. Okay, because what we're going to see then is that the sporophyte in more complex plants is the dominant portion, and the gametophyte becomes dependent on the sporophyte. So all the trees you see out there, those are sporophytes. And the gametophyte stage is actually microscopic, embedded in the tissues of the sporophyte. So in this case, it's different. You've got a large body relatively of both the gametophyte and the sporophyte, but the sporophyte has to grow out of the gametophyte. So we say it's dependent on the gametophyte. And it's related because it's got half the genes, but it could have gotten a sperm from a different gametophyte. So sexually reproducing species, that's good though, to mix up the genes, right? Because now we have different combinations of dominant and recessive genes. So new plant might have a different adaptation to survive. Alrighty, so that's a good question. And I think as we learn more about plants, the answer is going to be more obvious to you. So the sporophyte now, inside that capsule, it's producing spores by meiosis. Okay, so it's taking its cells and it's dividing them in half, or dividing the cells, making new cells, but it's dividing the chromosomes in half. So we go back to N. And that's what you see at number 6 there. At 5, those spores get dispersed. And that can be through water, even air can kind of blow them around, but it has to land on a moist surface. And when it lands on a moist surface, then we're at number 7, and it produces a structure called a protonema. And that's where the spore now can divide and produce a gametophyte. It produces the rhizoids and everything else, and it produces the gametophyte. You can see that little green starting to sprout there until they get a little bit longer and longer, producing the full gametophyte, and the cycle starts again. So in this stage, you can see that the gametophyte, very low to the ground, again, dependent on the moisture because they're only haploid. So that's a more stable environment in a moist environment. So any changes that occur, they'll probably have the genes for it and it won't damage the gene. So we always see haploid organisms where it's more stable environment. The sporophyte is growing up into the air. Okay, a little bit less stable, and so that's diploid. But because it's mainly all dependent on water anyway, the gametophyte is the dominant condition of the plant. All right. I know it's a little, let me go back and just show you this moss where I put the structure. Oh, no, not that one. Where is our moss? Oh, I remember. 4 types of plants. Let me show you this one again. This is a really nice picture of moss. So the low green carpet, that's the gametophyte. All of those stalks kind of sticking up, that's the sporophyte. So right now, this moss is reproducing in the diploid stage. The sporophytes are releasing spores. That's the only way to get new gametophytes. So again, those spores are gonna pop off and it can't really go far. Again, water, the rainwater could splash on it and can move it, but the spore has to hit a moist surface or it won't grow a gametophyte. Okay, and then when it does that, once the spores are released, all the little brown stuff at the top, all of the, like the long shaggy hair, that dies off, that just goes away. And then you'll just see that green carpet again. That's the gametophyte. So the sporophytes don't last very long. Okay, so that's why we also showed in that circle, the sporophyte stage being shorter. But the gametophyte stage lasts long. Okay, it's long-lived. All righty, let's go back. So that's our alternation of generations. So you really want to just kind of go back, look that over again and again, and make sure you can understand that. If you don't get it right away, again, don't forget, we're going to go over the alternation generation with all the plants. So you'll start to be able to compare this with the next one with the ferns, and then with the gymnosperms, and with the angiosperms. So you're going to see it a lot. So if you're not getting it right away, don't panic. Okay, so related to that is the reproduction section, right? So you saw in there the Antheridia and the Archegonia. So I just want to focus a little bit, zero in on that reproduction. So again, male plants bear Antheridia. That's the organ that produces sperm. And the sperm have a flagellum, so that's like the little tail. And that tail means that the sperm needs to swim to get to the egg. Okay? We see that in Animalia too. We have sperm that have little tails, so it has to be able to swim. So water dependent, right? The female plants bear the organ called the Archegonia, and that produces the eggs. So again, fertilization occurs when the sperm enters the cell of the egg and their nuclei fuse. So the chromosomes of the sperm are put into the same nucleus as the chromosomes of the egg. And so then you get your 2N condition, your diploid condition. Okay, so let's look at Antheridia. Let's see what they look like. You can zoom in on this. So under the microscope, if you zoomed in on the tip of the mosses, this is what you would see. These are Antheridia. And so all the little tiny circles inside of there is the tissue making the sperm. So all those little circles are sperm developing. Okay, you can see there's a little stalk that attaches it to the gametophyte portion of the plant. And then there's a little single cell coating, the sterile jacket. That's just the single cell coating. Sterile in this case means non-reproductive. Okay, so those cells aren't dividing. There are other cells inside of here that are dividing to make the sperm. And they're dividing by mitosis because the gametophyte plant is already haploid. Okay. Similarly, in the Archegonia just look different. Right, so at the end of a moss, a female moss, they have these structures. You can see the bracket there, that whole long structure is the archegonium, but the little circle in the middle is the egg. And so over to the right is the close-up. The long structure is the archegonium, and then it's pointing at the little circle. That's the egg in the middle. So that's where the sperm have to get there. The sperm again, get distributed. A splash comes. Let me go back to this guy. A splash comes, breaks open, the sterile jacket breaks open when these are ready to go. So a raindrop comes, it splashes it open, and all these little sperm just fly out. But they can only get to the archegonium as if there's plenty of water to be able to do that. And then they swim and they get down to the egg. And then fertilization occurs and we get the zygote. And the zygote develops in there and produces the sporophyte. So here's a little close-up then again. Our gametophyte, things to remember, it's N, so it's haploid, means half the number of chromosomes. So gametophytes make sperm and egg. The sperm has to swim to the egg, so it's very water dependent in the gametophyte. It's got to be in a moist environment because the sperm get released outside of the gametophyte body. So the environment has to be moist. Once they fuse, that's fertilization. It forms the diploid zygote. The zygotes remain sheltered within the archegonium. The gametophyte kind of feeds it. That's where the food comes from. And then it grows into the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte. Okay, the gametophyte is providing protection and nutrients. Oh, there we go. I forgot I had this. So there shows our antheridium with the sperm. It shows a droplet of rain bursted open. Our sperm now are swimming over to they're out in the environment and they're swimming over to the archegonium. You saw in moss though, they're really close together and they're small. So it's not a long journey, but it has to be wet. Okay. Here's a close-up of the archegonium, the sperm swimming down to it, getting to the egg. It fertilizes it. That's a zygote now, it's 2N, and the sporophyte's gonna grow. Okay, takes us to our sporophyte. Young sporophytes are known as embryos because now the zygote is dividing by mitosis to produce more cells, and it's retaining the 2N cells. Okay, they get produced then as the sporophyte grows, its job now is to produce spores. So the cap at the top of the sporophyte is called a sporangia. That's where these spores are developing. Spores develop through the process of meiosis. And so through the process of meiosis, you're splitting the number of chromosomes in half. Sorry, I'm grabbing my, my computer's gonna die, so I gotta plug it in. Right, so the spores now are haploid. And the spores get released into the environment by the sporophyte and they grow new gametophytes. And that's why the gametophyte is haploid. Okay, because the fertilization of egg and sperm occurred at the point to create a sporophyte. Sporophytes then produce spores. But again, through the process of meiosis, the cell division that splits the chromosomes one into each cell. So it becomes haploid. So a gametophyte develops. You know, I just realized I'll add onto Canvas, I'll find a video on YouTube that explains mitosis and meiosis to give you that background. So if you don't really remember it either from high school or I know some of you took general bio. Okay. So again, during evolution, as plants start to colonize further into land and they adapt to the dry environment, the sporophyte is going to become more larger and complex. Okay, because the sporophyte isn't as dependent on water as the gametophytes are. So the gametophytes now we're going to see are going to become embedded in the sporophyte tissue. So it says, so the gametophyte is like the fertilization period and the sporophyte is like the baby. Kind of. let's look at that alternation generations again. And maybe we can work that out. Wait, let me go back here. So the sporophyte, let's see, let's match what you said here. So the gametophyte is like the fertilization. So that's, the fertilization is the boundary between the gametophyte and the sporophyte. So sure, the gametophyte are the parent plants. Let's put it that way. The gametophyte are the parent plants because you have a male and a female. You've got one plant that makes sperm and you've got one plant that makes egg. They all live in a big cluster though, that you can see there. That's the population living there. Okay, so yeah, so they produce egg and sperm. They fertilize so that the sporophyte, yep, becomes the baby. There you go. Right, but that baby can produce new parents for someone else, because now that's what's producing the spores to produce new gametophytes. So that's where it gets a little, your analogy just gets off a little bit. Okay, what are the protonema? So protonema is the structure that develops from the spore that produces that the gametophytes grow out of. So that's for number 6, the spores get released. Those are haploid. And when they hit an appropriate ground surface, the ground is moist, then those spores germinate. That means those cells start to divide, right, to produce the structures of the gametophyte. And it starts with a protonema. So a spore develops a protonema, which then the gametophytes grow from that. So it's kind of like the base for a gametophyte to grow from, but the spores start it. Okay, and we're going to see more protonema. It's hard to visualize in mosses because they're microscopic. When we get to ferns and things, you'll see protonema, and they actually have like a heart-shaped structure. So those are, so again, this will build. So some things that maybe it's not making a whole lot of sense yet, it will as we see the other plants. Alrighty, so we got through all that. Let me, so I don't have to click through all this. Okay, and then here's just another, oh, well, this might answer your question, Dylan. So this kind of compares the gametophytes and the sporophytes. So way over on the left, that's what we were just looking at, mosses, bryophytes. You can see the gametophyte at the bottom and the sporophyte at the top. So the gametophyte is the dominant portion of the plant. It perpetuates, and a gametophyte can be male or female. And so this one must be a female because the sporophyte is growing out of it. Okay, and so you see the sporophyte at the top, that's going to produce the spores, and the spores will just be released into the environment to grow a new gametophyte. Okay, and it grows from a protonema, but you can't see it. Can't see it very well. In the middle panel, we'll discuss ferns next week, and you can kind of read ahead, and I'll get the lecture up soon, so you guys can do that. So now you can see that the gametophyte is reduced. You see it right at the end of that arrow. It's so small. Okay, but there are little structures on top of it. That's the Antheridia and the Archegonia, all those little dots. When you look at the one in the circle, you see the little dots. So that's Archegonia and Antheridia. So we'll see fertilization with that, and then that's going to produce the sporophyte. And look how big the sporophyte is. So now the sporophyte is getting bigger. That's where the vascularized tissue is. And then over on the right, you see our seed plants. Now you can only see the sporophyte. The gametophyte is embedded within the tissues of the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is dominant in our gymnosperms and angiosperms. This one's showing you a gymnosperm. Okay, so that's just a little comparison.